Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dave Noggle, University of Montana, and 14-year science advisor for the NRCS-led Sage Grouse Initiative. Ever since we launched in 2010 the Sage Grouse Initiative, we've had an unwavering shared vision of wildlife conservation through sustainable ranching. Fast forward to 2024, and not a word of that has changed. In 2015, when the Fish and Wildlife Service decided not to list the greater sage grouse or a threatened or endangered species, we hung in there and kept doing conservation on private lands and expanded that vision now to the entire sagebrush biome through our framework for conservation action in the sagebrush biome. In that framework, we've identified 4 biome-limiting threats that we focus on. The first being woodland expansion, which we heard a lot about this morning and some more today. Exotic annual grass invasions like cheatgrass, ventonata, and others. Land use conversion, where sagebrush rangelands are converted to, cultivated to croplands or subdivision. And riparian wet meadow degradation. As part of our SCD analysis, we see as we divide things like conservation easements in our work on conifer removal before versus during SGI, the initiative was a catalyst that focused conservation on private lands in the West and resulted in about a 4-fold increase on acres on the ground. 14 years later, we see durability, which is rare in conservation, as shown here through landowner participation, where we've continued every year, year in and year out, to sign up between 150 and 250 ranching families doing one or more beneficial SGI conservation actions. To take a quick SGI by the numbers peek, on the left-hand side, it's a $616 million Farm Bill investment since 2010. And the first pie chart cuts at about a 64 split. 60% of that investment over time has been in voluntary conservation easements, and the second half has been on restorative actions, primarily paid for by EQIP or the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, but other programs too under the Farm Bill. If you look deeper inside that 40%, on the right-hand side of the colored pie graph, about 60% of that has been prescribed grazing management, 38% has been brush management to remove conifers that have invaded into otherwise intact rangelands, and then that smaller 2% sliver is invasive weed treatments as the agency trains staff and gears up for a big defend the core push against annuals. So the big question, as we saw this morning, if you sat in on the first part of presentations, is targeting. And you heard targeting, 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 not business as usual, and it really matters where you work. And so the idea here on the left is, for an equal amount of effort, if you target the right practice to the right place, you're going to do a lot more good in conserving core and taking growth areas up to core status. The next step, in a word that wasn't maybe used as much today, but I will, is the idea of saturation. Let's not do one good thing in the right place. Let's go in at ecosystem levels, work with all of our partners, plan at appropriately large scales, and clean out the entire set of threats. And so when, in 2022, the sagebrush conservation design was created, SGI, as a mechanism for private lands conservation, said, ooh, this would be a cool way to retrospectively look at how well we've been targeting training SGI and partner staff in Farm Bill investments. And so basically today, as shown on the left, we're going to take those different investments and overlay them on SCD and see how we're doing and where we can improve in the future. You heard some this morning about SEI. I'm going to just touch it again here. So the underlying model for the sagebrush conservation design are these ecological integrity scores, and there's 5 of them. And people have been calling them Q values. Here's how I think of them. They're like being in college and getting your report card. Each one of those Q values is like getting a grade in a course. And then as you take your grades through time, they amalgamate into a GPA. And that GPA, if it's high enough, you get to be blue. And you got A's, and that's great. If you go, nah, B's, and I had to throw a C or two in there, you're going to be a growth opportunity area. Pretty darn good and balanced. It's that third one, which is other, which I always call degraded, where that's tough to call home and tell mom and dad about. So let's get into it. Here's how I'd like you to read this. This is efficacy and SGI targeting. The top bar focuses on the biome-wide categories from the conservation design for private lands. I'm going to focus on private lands because the Farm Bill is one of the primary mechanisms for working on that part of the broader partnership. If you're blue, that's the proportion of all private lands that aren't enrolled in SGI. If you're light blue, that's the proportion that's in growth, and degraded is the tan color. Then we're going to walk down using 2020, the year, as the baseline for comparison in SGI projects. So below that is conservation easements, core, growth, and other, taking all of those easement polygons, laying them over on SCD in 2020, and looking at those proportions. As you move down, prescribed grazing, brush management, which is the practice for cutting conifer out of rangelands, and invasive weeds is the last one. As you look at the vertical red bar, anything to the right of that is good targeting. So when you roll that up across all of our practices, my first take-home message is 62 to 84% of SGI practices fell within SCD's core and growth priorities. If you compare our least targeted practice to our most targeted practice and subtract those proportions from the core growth and other designations for unenrolled lands, we're 14 to 36%, or about a third better in our targeting than if we had just done it randomly. So SGI's Defend the Core approach is, I'm going to say, largely avoiding areas of low conservation success. And when I say that, I mean the tan degraded areas. So let's start breaking down by practice a little bit. Land use change and conservation easements. On the left, you see shaded the acreage annually enrolled in conservation easements before SGI, and on the left-hand side is during SGI. So you can see that increase in conservation easements that coming from our ASEP-ALE Regional Conservation Partnership Program, those types of resources. 8 of the years after SGI started, we had years where we were doing over 50,000 acres in perpetual conservation. If you look on the right, easements are among SGI's most successfully targeted actions. The upper bar of core growth and other is that unenrolled lands across the biome, privately owned. Below are conservation easements. So about 19% was not core growth, but if you know how conservation easements are administered, you try and take the entire ranch. If there's a little bit of degraded area, you sure don't want that to be fragmented more later on. And so, yeah, not perfect, but grabbing a lot of core and growth. But here I show the Rancher Stewardship Alliance, which is 3 counties on the High Line or northeast Montana. And you go, 3 counties? Is that big enough? Those 3 counties are about the size of the state of New Jersey. The red areas show within this huge core area more than 230,000 acres of perpetual conservation easement. And I'm going to let Jeff tell you more about how this voluntary conservation with easements has kept our biggest core in the state from disintegrating. Conifer removal. Conifer, too, is going to take a defend the core approach and a bunch of landscape thinking. In our SCD analysis, you'll see in the Great Basin these 9 colored in circles that all have a name. They encompassed 80% of all of our conifer cuts. And hereafter, I refer to these as legacy landscapes. These are the places where people said, we got to get together and do something big. And so let's take a look at those. Go back to your report card. These are the Q scores or SEI scores for trees in those 9 core areas. And what I'd like you to see is poor test scores in my analogy with Q going down, 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 down. In each one of these 9 legacy landscapes, when we targeted well in those and started cutting trees and getting to scale, we bent those curves. 7 of the 9 cores have improved scores. 2 of them we halted or stopped the degradation. So saturating these 9 landscapes proactively defends and grows core. He measured effectiveness a little bit deeper even. Here, we identify effectiveness as the fraction of cut areas that improved or maintained core and growth status relative to the background rates of change that were going on, right? Remember, SCD is largely based on the rangeland analysis platform, and so you not only have space, but you have time and change going on. And so we were 20% more effective at targeting and saturating cores and maintaining core or growth status when we worked big and when we worked together. The other 20% of our cuts that were more isolated and scattered only improved core or growth status by 5%. As Tina told us this morning, business as usual is not going to work. We got to do it up front. We got to do it big with partnerships, and we have to have conducive management support above us so that our practitioners can go big and think big and do stuff like we haven't before. Here, we took the change in SCD from 2010 to 2020. If you're blue, you were core or you moved up to core status in that last decade. If you're tan, you were degraded and stayed that way. If you were red, you were core or growth that went down in your status. When Tina goes, Noggle keeps saying that we're getting our lunch eaten by invasives, this is that map. So we went back to SEI scores again. Here, the top of the left-hand graphic is 0. If there's a bar above 0, it means that the Q scores for annual invasives are getting better in our legacy landscapes. There's no bar above 0. They're all below, which means that even though we partnered, we thought big, we got rid of trees, invasives are still kicking us. We're going to have to go back into some of those legacy landscapes, and some of these local partnerships already are, and we're going to have to get rid of those invasives if we want to maintain and keep those cores. It's the big message is when you start this stuff, conservation's never really done. These are conservation dependent landscapes. I wanted to show you too on the lower part. This is acreage of conifer removal in SGI, with the gray being before the launch of the initiative and after. And what you'll see is we were going up, 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 up in acres till about 5 years ago. And now we're doing less. We're thinking that those declining acreages in the Great Basin are likely to be offset by increasing cuts east of the Rocky Mountains. Keep your eye open when my colleague, Jason Reinhardt, talks about his new and improved targeting tool for conifer. Watch where his future designated priorities are. They're gonna pick out a lot of places in Montana and Wyoming. NRCS has seen that coming, and we're staffing up in those areas to replace some of those acres lost in the Great Basin. Here's my future look slide. Interpret these just like you have been. but it's not just a 2020 baseline. I'm throwing in time now. So at the top, let's use prescribed grazing, for example. There's 3 bars instead of 1 for each conservation practice. The top bar is 2010, the middle bar is 2015, and the bottom one now you've seen before is 2020. And so your eyes now go to brush management for conifer, invasive annuals, and now the bottom one is the biome-wide SCD, designations of core growth and others. So now you've got time in here. That dotted line that's making that angle is telling it we're not changing our targeting. This is a retrospective look saying annuals are kicking us in every practice except conservation easements. And so there's this slow degrade of past efforts. And so if you've seen anything from this morning or in the afternoon talks here, we got to get on top of annuals, and we have to do it very targeted and intelligently if we want to win. SGI, as a partner in the biome, is trying to do our part. You can see through time on the blue bars, we're getting more acreage annually treated by invasives. We're trying to target it. We're learning about our legacy landscapes. The y-axis isn't hundreds of thousands of acres. If you can't read it in the back, it's like 20,000. And so this is where we're going to gear up, and our tech transfer people are getting the information put together to train lots of people. There's a new inaugural training coming in 2024. Jeremy, the Imagine group at University of Wyoming, and this big coalition that many of you might have put some resources into, they thought maybe we could get 200 people on Zoom and really get them thinking differently. As of yesterday, they had 500 people enrolled in that. And so now they moved the cap up to 1,000. People are hungry for this information. We're learning how to do this better, and our tech people are going to get folks empowered to take action. As a summary, the NRCS led SGI as a primary catalyst for private lands rangeland conservation in the West. Spatial technologies enable NRCS to quantify conservation outcomes at these biome level scales. SGI is successfully targeting most, not all of our actions, 62 to 84%, depending on what practice we're talking about, to those SCD core and growth priorities. And we're going to take SCD and we're going to put it into our trainings and start getting that into our staff's minds and thought processes as they plan future actions. Targeted woodland management's restoring ecological integrity, but despite success, we're going to have follow-up treatments on invasive annuals if we want to safeguard those initial investments. Well-targeted easements have averted the loss of Montana's core area. If we had more time, I could tell you sister stories in southwest Wyoming, the Pioneer Alliance in central Idaho. Yeah, our easement program is an impressive part of SGI. And SGI's focus is on scaling up invasive annuals, and that's where we're headed next to defend the core. Thanks.